everyone, it's Mia and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the 11 books that I read in January. So the first book that I read in January was The Hayden Game by Sally Thorne. It was so great. I gave it 5 stars. This was a reread, so I read it last year and I only gave it 4 stars, but this year I really appreciated it a lot more and I gave it 5 stars. I think it's because when I first read it, I was kind of unused to the whole romance genre, but since then I've read a little more romance, so I feel like I understand the genre better, and this way I appreciate the book a lot more. I did make a video about it, comparing it to another book that I read this month, if you want to check it out. It's basically me discussing how the hate to love trope is written and why I think The Hayden Game was done really well, so yeah. So the next book that I read was The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, which if you're on booktube right now watching this, then you've probably heard of it because it is really popular. So I gave this book 3 stars. It was another reread, so I had listened to it as an audiobook before, however I wanted to read the last book in the series, The Queen of Nothing, because it's a trilogy, and I knew that if I wanted to read that I had to like refresh my mind on everything that happened. So I reread it and honestly my opinion didn't really change. Basically my overall thoughts is that I think the concepts and ideas are good, but I just don't think it's properly well executed. So I really like the world and I like the idea of all this political intrigue, but I think the actual story that emerged from these ideas wasn't as good as it could have been. Another thing that I didn't really like as much this time was the Carden and Jude romance, because the first time that I listened to the book I really liked it. I mean, I'm not saying that it's like a good relationship, but like it's really interesting, but this time I didn't care as much and I didn't find the whole story arc as satisfying. So since I only gave it 3 stars, I'm not quite sure whether I should continue reading the series. I do have The Wicked King with me, but I don't know whether I should read it and try and finish the end of the Folk of the Air trilogy. I don't know, maybe. We'll see. Let me know if you think it's worth it. So the next book I read was The Unholy Munis by Christina Lauren. So this is the romance book that I compared to The Hayden Game because I like to describe it as The Hayden Game mixed with Just Go With It. You know that movie? So I gave The Unholy Munis 2 stars because I thought it was simply okay, but I was really disappointed in it. Basically, I read it because I wanted to fill the hole in my heart that The Hayden Game had left in there, but ultimately I was disappointed. I go into a lot more detail about why I didn't like it as much in my comparison video. So the next book I read was The Barefoot Investor by Scott Pape. Now if you're in Australia and you've walked past any bookstore or any library, you've probably seen this book around because it's really popular. I mean, I know there's a lot of famous finance books, but like this is the one that everyone uses even if they don't know anything about finances, which is me. So last year I had read this book for the first time. I listened to it as an audiobook, but I thought the tips were really helpful, so I wanted to get a paper version so I could make notes and underline things, that kind of thing. So I did get the paper version and I read it and I really liked it. I think that it's really accessible, like it's really easy to understand. In addition to all of the financial advice, I think there's enough humor and side anecdotes, those kind of things, to keep the book not totally dry. It's a good book. I like it. So I gave it 4 stars. So the next book that I read is Mistborn: The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. Now if you're a fantasy reader, you've probably heard of this book and series. I know it's really popular and it's really well loved, and I really enjoyed this first book. It was a reread for me because I want to read the whole series, and in the past I've only read the first 2 books, so I wanted to reread them again just so I could finish off the series, like finish the last book, which, you know what? That seems to be a running theme in my life. Another thing about Brandon Sanderson's writing is that it's really quite basic and simple, so it's really easy to read if you want to start fantasy. This was the first series that I read to like try and get into the adult fantasy genre, so it is really easy to read and really easy to understand. So there are a number of characters, but the 2 main characters I would say are really well developed. I like Vin, I like Kelsia. I think they're really well done. And also there's other side characters who I really like, but there's another thing I have to comment on. Alright, first I'm going to talk about the story and then relate that to the characters. So basically the logline for this world is what if the Dark Lord won? So the main story is about this street urchin called Vin who doesn't realize that she has powers. So she joins a group of criminals and their plan is to overthrow the Dark Lord. So yes, that's the plan. But one of the things that I didn't like about the characters was that all of the crew members kind of all blurred together for me because the majority of them are just middle-aged men. And even though this was my second reading, I still had trouble kind of distinguishing between them, and I kind of wish that they just had more distinguishing features, which could have been that some of them could have been females. I'm just saying that there were very few female characters in this book. With that being said, I still really enjoyed the book. Next, we're going to be talking about Scythe by Neil Shusterman. I borrowed it as an audiobook and I listened to it and I really, really liked it. I gave it 4 stars, and I know there were mixed reviews about it, so I know that some people really don't like it, and I understand why, because it does get slow, and if I was reading it as a physical book then I might have been more frustrated, but since I was listening to it as an audiobook, it didn't really annoy me as much. Another criticism is the 2 main characters and the romance. Okay, so yes, I know that the romance is really weak. I just ignore that. I just say that it's like the beginning of a romance, but not quite. And as for the 2 characters, I think they were sympathetic and likable enough. Anyway, let's talk about some of the good things. So I really think that this book was interesting in many ways. I think the plot was fun and entertaining, and I also think that the ideas brought up by this book were really interesting as well, because now it is time for me to talk about what this book is, because I forgot to at the start. Basically, this book is about the future where there are people called scythes who have to glean people, and gleaning basically means killing. So basically they're like legal murderers. Oh, also another thing is that in the future everyone is immortal. So I think this was really interesting in a numerous amount of ways, because not only does it talk about the morality of killing people, but it also talks about mortality. I had always thought that it would be fantastic if everyone was immortal. Well, not fantastic, but I always thought that it wouldn't really be a problem. But this book made me think about a lot of things, especially like how being mortal really shapes the human condition. And I know that sounds so obvious, but I never had really thought about it in that much depth before. Because one thing this book talks about is how if you're immortal, then you never really have to work towards anything, and you never really have to like go and achieve your dreams or your goals or do something that makes your life meaningful, because you're gonna live forever. And that just made me think about like how we live as humans now, and I guess I never really had thought about how we all have this sort of urgency in our life because we know we're gonna die. And I don't know, this book opened my eyes, because before I was kind of just like la-di-da-da. So I really appreciate this book for doing that, and I definitely want to read the rest of this series. So the next book is The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo. So I borrowed this also as an audiobook. I gave this book 3 stars because, you know what, it wasn't bad. It was enjoyable to listen to, it had good advice. Another thing about this audiobook was that it was narrated by someone else, so not the author, but nonetheless I still heard Marie Kondo's voice come through the book a lot. And I feel like through this book I really understood her personality, which was cool. So the next book I read was a graphic novel called Bloom by Kevin Panetta, and it was illustrated by Savannah Garnchow. This book I gave 2 stars because even though the art is so beautiful and the concept is such a good idea, ultimately I didn't feel that connected to the characters or the plot. And even though this book seems pretty long, I still felt like nothing much happened and it didn't really resolve itself in a nice, satisfying arch. With that being said, this book is still sweet and fluffy. Oh, I should also talk about what this book is about, because I always forget to give a synopsis. Basically, this book is about this boy called Aristotle, and he works in his family's bakery, and then the bakery hire this other dude called Hector to help out in the bakery, and as you can guess, it's basically about those 2 forming a relationship and ultimately falling in love. Next, we're going to talk about another graphic novel called Pumpkinheads by Rainbow Rowell and Faith Erin Hicks. So this book is also really sweet and cute. So it's about these 2 friends, Josiah and Deja, I think that's how you pronounce it, and they both work at this a pumpkin patch place, and it's their last night there and they go on this adventure, and I gave it 4 stars. Well, this graphic novel, though it is predictable, has a nice, satisfying arch plot that I really like, and I also really liked the characters because I felt like I knew them and I understood their relationship, so I really liked that. Okay, now we're up to book 10. So this book is Hive by AJ Betts, and this is an Australian book, and I listened to this as an audiobook and I gave it 1 star. Now that sounds really harsh. Actually no, I gave it 1.5 stars. And that still sounds harsh. And maybe I was just in a really grumpy mood, but I thought this book was less than okay, but almost okay. I don't really know how to describe this book without giving much away, but it's basically a girl in this world who realizes not everything is as it seems. This book had such a good concept and it was so interesting, and yet it annoyed me because of certain things. So I think the characters are alright, but I just didn't care about any of them to really invest in their story. And I like how nothing is like explicitly told to you, but as the reader you kind of figure out what's happening. But that being said, I don't think that the ending or the mysteries were strong enough for me to care about the rest of the story and to figure out what happens next. So the last book that we have is Quicksand by Malin Persson Giolito. I hope I pronounced that right. So basically it's a courtroom thriller about the main character Maya, and she's accused of being part of this school shooting that happened in Sweden. So this is a Swedish book and it was translated into English. So this book I gave 2.5 stars because the thing is, I both liked it and I didn't like it. So let me just talk about the things I didn't like first. One of the things it had on the front page was this book talking about how this book explored racial and economic tensions in Sweden. So I was really interested in that. I was kind of disappointed because even though this book does deal with race and class, I feel like this book discusses those ideas really explicitly because those ideas are all really explored in dialogue and literal discussion rather than events. And another thing is that even though race and class is important to the plot, it is only important to an extent. So I feel like those ideas are almost separated from the crime of the book. Like that's the main thing that's driving the book, and this is just kind of almost a separate thing. But I think this book could have been a lot stronger if these ideas more heavily affected the actual plot. Another thing that really annoyed me was the boyfriend, who was super important to the plot and the story, and you know, he is the killer, he is the murderer, he is the school shooter. I don't know anything about him because he's like a super important character. I feel like he's almost a plot device. He's a person that's needed for the story, but he isn't really a character. Like, I just feel like he could have been a lot stronger, and since he wasn't, everything else in the story that relies on him being strong kind of just is floppy and weak because he is not strong and he's like the foundation, I guess. So that being said, there were a lot of really good things about this book though, and even though I kind of criticized the writer a lot, I still think that she was really good. Her writing, her descriptions were really well done, and her characterization of the main character Maya was really good because Maya had a strong voice, and also she was the perfect type of unlikable, and she is just likable enough for you to care enough about her to find out the outcome of the court case and to find out what really happened, but still she is just enough unlikable to make her morality seem ambiguous. Anyway, those are all the 11 books that I read this January. If you want to see more book related videos, consider subscribing to my channel or checking out my other videos, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!